The beautiful aroma of turkey roasting in the oven and mashed potatoes fill the air of every home in the United States on the fourth Thursday in the month of November. It's Thanksgiving, and everyone is back home for the holidays, sitting around the dining table and sharing what they are grateful for. But for the Native Americans, Thanksgiving means something entirely different from all that. For these ones, it runs a lot deeper than roasted turkey, mashed potatoes, green beans, and whatnot. Unfortunately, not a lot of people know this. Welcome back to Prometheus Network. In today's video, as we draw closer and closer to Thanksgiving, we will be sharing with you what Thanksgiving really means from the perspective of a Native American. Feel free to get comfortable and stick around till the end. In American schools today, students are usually taught a common story of pilgrims meeting the Indians and all of that ending with a wonderful dinner, and that's all. However, as we already established, there is a lot more to the events that occurred. At the beginning of the 17th century, southern New England housed a collection of busy communities within different confederations. These particular people were the people of the First Light, and their home was called the Dawn Land. Its political leader, the Sachems, had been trading with the Europeans for more than 100 years, even before the Pilgrims came around. But unfortunately, this relationship that had been built soured after the locals were kidnapped to be sold as slaves by deceitful Europeans. Tradesmen came along with a disease and infected the Dawn Land, and this caused the locals to die in packs due to their intense low immunity. In the space of just 3 years, about 90% of the entire locals were completely wiped out in the different confederations, Wampanoag included. Massasoit, who was the head sachem-in-chief, realized how close the land was to being crushed by their enemies, the Narragansett. However, he was still bent on saving his people from the fate that had befallen them. Unbeknownst to the Pilgrims, this was the kind of political world they were able to be introduced to. At the time, these ones weren't referred to as Pilgrims, at least by their contemporaries. They were rather referred to as Separatists, which was a branch of the English Puritans. Unfortunately, King James wasn't a fan of these Puritans. In fact, he hated these ones, and so he began to prosecute them in the year 1604. And because of this, the Separatists ran off to Holland, where they weren't going to be prosecuted for worshipping. However, for fear of losing both their national and communal identities, the assembly sought a new place where their church would be planted. After much deliberation, America was the first pick, and so they went on and requested a patent from King James, one that would permit them to build a colony. To pay off the debts they owed their investors, they made plans to catch fish as a source of income. By September 6th, the Mayflower set out, and just 2 months later, Cape Cod was detected, and a group of 16 men was sent out to check out the area. Sadly, the settlers had no idea how to fish, and they had already started running out of food. Due to that, they began to steal from graves, storage pits, and even people's homes, just so everyone could be kept alive. But soon, they had their very first encounter with this native, which turned out to be rather hostile, but thankfully, no life was lost. By the 12th of December, they got to New Plymouth, and by January, they got busy with construction. By the end of winter, they had already lost about 44 settlers due to bad conditions, which included lack of shelter, scurvy, and even more, the fact that they had been living on board the Mayflower. In March, the settlers were quite shocked when they were greeted by a man named Samoset in English. Samoset went on to explain to them that they were constructing on a village called Patuxet. Apparently, the residents of this village had all perished due to the recent epidemic that hit their land. According to Samoset, this village belonged to the Wampanoag, and he also advised them that the chief of the village, Massasoit, was watching all that they were doing. The settlers were so eager to trade, and so a few days later, Samoset came back with furs and also with co-workers alongside a man called Tisquantum, popularly called Squanto. Squanto had come to relay the news in fluent English that Massasoit had finally arrived, with his past experiences with English men and what havoc they caused in his village. The sachem didn't trust the settlers. as a hostage and also to declare their peaceful intentions. Edwards Winslow, the third governor of New Plymouth, was sent to Massasoit. Satisfied by their offering, Massasoit went into New Plymouth and was greeted by the governor. They created a peace treaty that included mutual protection in case of enemies' attacks. With Squanto around, the settlers began to live better lives. He guided them on how to grow crops and became an important part of the land as an interpreter. The Separatists saw him as God's gift to them. But actually, Squanto had, in fact, been part of those that were kidnapped from Patuxet in 1614 and were shipped to Spain as a slave. He later found himself in London, in the home of a merchant that taught him English, and even went as far as arranging for his return back home to Dawnland by 1619. Unfortunately, Patuxet no longer existed, as it had been completely wiped out by the epidemic. As he had spent so much time abroad, Massasoit took him in with a lot of suspicions, but with the fact that he needed a translator to negotiate with the settlers. Still very suspicious of Squanto, Massasoit sent his warrior Hobomok to live amongst the settlers and also kept a close eye on him. By fall, thanks to all they had been taught by Squanto, the settlers had an abundant harvest and declared a feast so they could celebrate. Massasoit came around as well, and with him were about 90 warriors and 5 deer for the feast. This feast lasted for about 3 days, and throughout this time, the English and Wampanoag ate and enjoyed each other's company. This right here is the well-known first Thanksgiving that children learn about today. However, the name we chose to give this ceremony isn't something the settlers would have picked out for a harvest feast. For the Puritans, a Thanksgiving Day was a day they fasted and gave thanks to God in their prayers. However, unlike what the general public may be aware of, the story between the Pilgrims and the Indians didn't just end with the bountiful harvest and a splendid 3-day-long feast. In the first year of New Plymouth, Squanto had been cooking up something. Seeing that he had so much power as the only person who could fluently speak English of all his people, he came up with a plan to overthrow Massasoit. You can immediately see the reason why Massasoit wanted to make sure an eye was placed on him. He convinced the locals of the land that he could easily command the English to wage war or bring peace as he will. Suspicious of the Squanto's moves and mannerisms, Hobomok went out of his way and gave a warning to Governor Bradford. In no time, Squanto's plans were discovered and taken straight to the table of Massasoit, who became very furious. He knew he had every reason to have been suspicious of Squanto, and now he had gotten an actual reason. Immediately, he ordered that Squanto be handed over and executed, but Governor Bradford refused to comply as the interpreter was very important to just give him up like that. However, based on the treaty that had been signed, Squanto's life rightfully belonged in the hands of Massasoit, the sachem, and so Bradford was left with no better choice than to give in to the demands that were made. But just as he was about to hand Squanto over to the sachem, an unidentified ship came into the picture. It caused an alarm, and this delayed Bradford's handover, and even more left Massasoit's envoys very worried, angry at the entire situation, and starting to get very impatient. They simply walked away. Apparently, this ship that had just arrived carried with it 60 Englishmen, with plans of building a colony very close to Boston. They completely abused the Massachusetts locals, and this led to a huge conspiracy to assassinate the colonists. On getting knowledge about the plans that the locals were making, the leaders of New Plymouth initiated a proactive strike in order to save their brazen countrymen. They were able to buy some peace, but that was just for a particular time. In this same period between the years 1620 and 1640, more of the Puritan settlers arrived, and in no time, they outnumbered the natives in the land. This was the Great Migration. While the treaty that had been signed between the Pilgrims and Massasoit lasted until the sachem death, the new Puritans had no affiliation with the alliance the others had formed. The principles that had been tied to their fanatic religion made sure that whatever peace that had been long formed between the two cultures was short-lived. In the eyes of the Puritans, the Native Americans were simply wild, savage, and godless. With such a notion about the locals, the end was almost inevitable. if the natives refused to convert to the religion of the Puritans, which was Christianity, and completely surrendered their cultural identity, they were eliminated. And given that they had already outnumbered the natives, there was no way to fight back. The very first Thanksgiving was a merry moment between two very different worlds, but unfortunately, all that was short-lived. The capitalist opportunities that were presented by the Dawnland, alongside their fervent practical beliefs, were the motive behind wiping away the native inhabitants. All of this, however, doesn't take away the joy of enjoying a beautiful feast of thanks with the ones you love. However, it is important that we keep in mind all of the events that brought about the holiday and not just the chipped-out versions that happened to leave everyone happy. This is simply because, for the Native Americans, this is simply a day of mourning all of their ancestors and grieving the genocide that was orchestrated by the Puritans. Hopefully, everyone will begin to acknowledge all that actually occurred that led to Thanksgiving. There you have it, folks. Hopefully, all this was enough to teach you something new when you next sit around the table for a Thanksgiving meal. If you enjoyed the video, do well to give it a thumbs up and let us know your view on the topic of Thanksgiving in the comment section below. Also, remember to subscribe to the channel and turn on post notifications so you never miss an upload. Thank you very much for watching. See you next time.